They called it the Great Tranquility, and it had descended upon humanity not with a bang, but with a gentle, hushing whisper. The architects, the celestial saviors who arrived in ships like spun moonlight, had not conquered Earth. They had healed it. They had scrubbed the skies of their filth, sweetened the oceans, and silenced the groaning tectonic plates. With gifts of shimmering technology and biological attunements, they had cured every disease, ended every famine, and smoothed the frantic, jagged edges of the human soul. War was a forgotten word, a relic studied by scholars like me. Hate was a diagnosed chemical imbalance, corrected with a painless somatic infusion. Passion, ambition, grief, these were the fevers of a primitive age, now cooled and managed into a placid, sustainable contentment. Humanity had been given peace, a perfect, sterile, unending peace. And in exchange, we had only given up everything that made us human. My name is Kalen, and as the senior archivist of the Soul Memorial Archive, my job was to be the caretaker of a ghost. The archive was a silent, temperature-controlled tomb dedicated to the pre-tranquility era, the so-called Age of Tumult. Here, in shielded data vaults and static display cases, rested the artifacts of our feral ancestors' rusted firearms, faded protest banners, books with pages warped by what their records called tears. I walked these halls every day, surrounded by the echoes of a species I could no longer recognize. My contemporaries saw this place as a museum of madness, a catalog of self-inflicted wounds. They would walk through, their faces serene and untroubled, observing the artifacts of rage and sorrow with the detached curiosity of one viewing caged, extinct animals. But for me, it was a sanctuary of questions. My work was my life, a quiet rebellion against the serene emptiness of the world outside. I spent my days not just preserving the data, but trying to feel it. I'd run my fingers over the brittle pages of a poet's diary, her script wild and chaotic as she wrote of a lost love, and I would try to understand the concept of an emotion so powerful it demanded to be scrawled onto paper. I would listen to the symphonies of the old masters, music filled with jarring, dissonant chords that the architect's own harmonious compositions lacked. They called it a tonal anxiety, a symptom of a sick society. I called it beautiful. My assistant, a placid young man named Ryan, would often watch me, a faint, pleasant smile on his face. He was a perfect product of the new age, his emotions as smooth and level as a pane of glass. You spend so much time with the dissonance. Archivist, he'd say, his voice a melodic, untroubled hum. Does it not cause you distress? I would simply shake my head, unable to explain that the dissonance was the only thing that felt real. The distress came from the silence that followed, from the perfect, unwavering peace that waited for me outside the archive's lead-lined doors. The truth was, I was a flaw in the system, a genetic throwback. The somatic attunements that kept the rest of humanity in a state of blissful equilibrium had never fully taken root in my system. I could not feel the soaring rage or profound grief I read about. Not truly, but I could feel their absence. It was a hollow ache in my chest, a constant, low-grade hum of wrongness, like a phantom limb that remembered how to clench into a fist. The change began with the recovery of a single, corrupted data shard, designated Remnant 734. It was pulled from the wreckage of a pre-architect submarine, deep within the Marianas Trench. For months, Our restoration systems had tried to piece together its fragmented files, but the data was locked behind layers of what the system called trauma-based encryption. It was a concept our modern AI, named the Warden, could barely comprehend. The data appears to be hiding from itself. The Warden would report, its voice a synthesized chorus of perfect harmony. Its core logic is fragmented by recursive loops of what can only be described as simulated pain. It was a puzzle I couldn't resist. Bypassing Ryan and the public terminals, I worked late into the nights, alone in the archive's core, interfacing directly with the shard. I wrote new algorithms, not based on logic and order, but on the chaotic patterns I'd studied in ancient art and music. I taught the recovery program to think not like a machine, but like a wounded animal. And then, one night, it worked. The encryption broke. It wasn't a military file, a state secret, or a scientific breakthrough. It was a video log, a simple, personal recording from a soldier named Anya Sharma, dated from the final corporate war of the 21st century. The video flickered to life on my console, a window into a world of grit and shadow. Anya was not serene. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with dried tears. Her eyes, dark and blazing, held an intensity that felt like a physical blow. She wasn't speaking to a camera. She was speaking to someone named Ben. She spoke of the battle, of the mud and the blood and the screaming. But mostly, she spoke of loss. She described holding a fallen comrade in her arms, a young man who had died in her lap. Her voice, raw and broken, didn't just convey sadness, it built a cathedral to it. Then, she began to talk about the enemy, the corporation that had taken her friend's life, that had burned her home, that had poisoned her world. And as she spoke, the grief in her eyes began to burn, to sharpen, to transform into something else. It was a cold, pure, terrifying fire. "They think we'll break. Ben," she whispered, her voice a guttural rasp that scraped against the inside of my skull. "They think we'll scatter. But we're not going to break. We're going to burn them from this earth. Not for victory, not for resources, for this, for him. We're going to make them remember his name." She never said the word. She didn't have to. It was there, in the clench of her jaw, the tremor in her hands, the white-hot focus in her gaze. It was vengeance. As I watched, something inside me tore open. A dam I never knew existed burst, and a flood of alien sensation rushed in. It was bitter and hot. A coiling serpent in my gut. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic, chaotic rhythm I had only ever read about. My vision blurred, and a sound escaped my lips, a choked, ugly sob that was equal parts sorrow and something darker, something exhilarating. I stumbled back from the console, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The warden's voice chimed, calm and immediate. "Archivist Kalen, your biometric readings are anomalous. Heart rate is elevated to 164 beats per minute. Adrenal output has spiked by 900%. You're experiencing extreme emotional dissonance. Shall I dispatch a wellness unit? Wellness unit." I knew what that meant. A visit from the Seraphim, the human liaisons of the architects, with their gentle hands and their silver needles filled with balancing serums that would patch the cracks in my soul, cool the fever, and return me to the placid emptiness. They would erase this feeling. They would erase her. No, I stammered, clutching my chest. No. Warden. It's a system malfunction. A biofeedback error from the shard. Acknowledged, the warden replied, though I could sense its subroutines flagging my file, marking me for observation. I would advise stepping away from the artifact. Its chaotic resonance may be hazardous. Hazardous. Yes. It was the most dangerous thing in the world, and it was the only thing I had ever wanted. I shut down the console and erased the access logs, my mind racing. The feeling was already starting to fade, the fire sinking back into embers. But the memory of the heat remained. It was a promise. I had been asleep my entire life, and Anya Sharma had just screamed me awake. The world outside the archive looked different the next morning. The perfect, clean lines of the city seemed fragile. The serene smiles of the people felt like masks. And the harmonious music that drifted from the public emitters sounded like a funeral dirge. The peace was a lie. It wasn't a gift. It was a cage. And for the first time, I could see the bars. My encounter with the Seraphim came 2 days later. He didn't announce himself. One moment I was cataloging pre-tumult literature. The next he was simply there, standing silently at the end of the aisle. His name was Lyran. Like all Seraphim, he was unnervingly beautiful, his features a perfect, symmetrical blend of races, his eyes the color of pale lavender. He wore simple white robes, and his presence exuded a calm so profound it felt like a physical weight. "Archivist Kalen," he said. His voice was not sound, but a vibration that seemed to emanate directly inside my head. "We were concerned. The warden logged a significant bioempathetic event." He took a step closer, his gaze gentle, searching. "You have been spending a great deal of time immersed in the traumas of the past. Sometimes, the echoes can cling." I forced myself to remain calm, to smooth my own features into the placid mask of contentment everyone else wore. It was a data surge from a corrupted artifact, a momentary feedback loop. It is resolved. Lyran's smile didn't waver, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were ancient and knowing, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the archive's climate control. "Of course," he murmured, "but dissonance, even when resolved, can leave a residue, a tendency toward emotional imbalance. The architects have developed a new attunement, a simple infusion that can strengthen the somatic regulators and ensure lasting tranquility. A gift to help you." He held out his hand, and in his palm lay a small silver injector, no bigger than a needle. It was an offer presented as a kindness, but it was a death sentence. It would not just erase the memory of the fire Anya Sharma had lit in me. It would tear out the fireplace itself, leaving nothing but smooth, cold stone. He was here to lobotomize my soul, my survival instincts, dormant for a lifetime. Scream to life. I needed to run, to hide, to find a place where his tranquility couldn't reach me. I gave him a slow, serene nod. "Thank you, Seraphim Lyran. Your concern is a comfort. May I have a moment to conclude my work cycle before accepting this gift? The archive's temporal seals are delicate." The lie was thin, but it was rooted in the protocols he and the architects had established. Order and process were paramount in their perfect world. He paused, his head tilting slightly. For a moment, I was certain he could hear the frantic drumming of my heart. But then he gave a slight bow. "Of course. Archivist. Order must be maintained. I will wait in the grand hall." The moment he turned and glided away, I moved. There was no time to think, only to act. I didn't head for the exits. I knew they would be monitored. I went deeper into the archive, into the sublevels where the most dangerous artifacts were kept, the ones too volatile for public display. I was running on instinct, on the ghost of a feeling from a dead soldier's recording. My destination was a section of the archive known as the Obsidian Vault, a place Ryan and the others avoided. It housed the remnants of humanity's most self-destructive creations, viral agents, psychological weapons, and the theoretical blueprints for technologies that bent the laws of physics. But I wasn't looking for a weapon. I was looking for a map. My access codes. An archivist's privilege opened the heavy doors. Inside, I raced to a terminal that was firewalled from the warden's main network. This was the system that managed the unstable population, the small, scattered communities of individuals like me, the genetic throwbacks whose minds had rejected the architect's gift of peace. Society called them the dissonant. They were treated as unwell, given secluded habitats in the ruins of the old world where they could live out their chaotic, unhappy lives without disturbing the great tranquility. To the Seraphim, they were a sad, compassionate project. To me, they were my only hope. I searched for habitation zones, cross-referencing them with geological surveys that showed areas of high electromagnetic interference places where the architect's constant nanite surveillance would be weakest. One location stood out a settlement deep within the scarred canyons of what was once called the American Southwest. It was designated Sanctuary 7. According to the files, its population had the highest concentration of recessive emotional spectrum markers on the planet. They were the incurables, the truly broken. My people. I downloaded the coordinates and a topographical map onto a shielded data chip, then triggered a containment protocol breach in a distant wing of the archive. A noisy, chaotic event that would draw the warden's attention and, hopefully, cover my escape. As alarms began to chime, their harmonious tones doing little to mask the urgency, I slipped out through an old service tunnel, its existence a forgotten footnote in the archive's perfect blueprints. I ran into the dark, leaving behind a world of sterile light and suffocating peace. For the first time, my life had a purpose, a direction. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. I was no longer a caretaker of ghosts. I was going to learn how to become one. The service tunnel was a gullet of the old world, choked with the dust of forgotten decades. It was a place of rough-hewn concrete and weeping pipes, a stark, brutalist counterpoint to the seamless, glowing architecture of the city above. Every breath I took was thick with the scent of rust and decay, a smell so alien and vital it felt like I was inhaling history itself. The harmonious chimes of the containment alarm faded behind me, replaced by the frantic, arrhythmic pounding of my own heart. I ran with the awkward, untrained gait of a scholar, my body a clumsy vessel for the sudden fierce urgency that now commanded it. When I finally pushed open a corroded maintenance hatch and stumbled into the dim twilight of the city's underbelly, the transition was jarring. This was the subgrid, the city's mechanical and waste processing level, a place no citizen ever saw. Here, the serene illusion of the world above was stripped away, revealing the humming, grinding machinery that sustained the lie. Towering recyclers pulsed with a dull, rhythmic thud, and autonomous sanitation drones zipped through the canyons of steel, their optical sensors glowing a cold, indifferent blue. The air was thick with the tang of ozone and sterilized refuse. It was a world devoid of beauty or comfort, yet it felt more honest than the pristine parks and plazas I had left behind. My escape was a desperate improvisation. The city's public transport system was a web of surveillance, each pod and rail car tracked by the warden's omnipresent gaze. To use it would be to surrender. My map, stored on the shielded data chip in my pocket, showed the old world ruins began just beyond the city's western perimeter, a sprawling graveyard of pre-architect civilization. That was my destination. I moved through the shadows of the subgrid, a ghost in the machine, my archivist's knowledge of city schematics finally serving a purpose beyond academic curiosity. I found a decommissioned cargo lift at the edge of the processing sector, a relic the architect's modernization had somehow overlooked. With a groan of protesting metal, it carried me upwards, not into the gleaming city, but onto a deserted perimeter platform that overlooked the boundary. The sight that greeted me stole my breath. Below me, the perfect, illuminated city ended as abruptly as a line drawn in the sand. Beyond it lay a different world, a landscape of skeletal high-rises and cratered highways, all bathed in the raw, unfiltered light of a setting sun. The air that washed over me was different, too. It was wild and untamed, carrying the scent of dust, wild vegetation, and something else, the faint, a metallic tang of rain on old stone. For a lifetime, I had been breathing the conditioned, sterile air of a terrarium. This was the air of a planet. The journey on foot was a brutal education. The theoretical knowledge I had of the age of tumult was a useless shield against the reality of its remains. The ground was uneven, littered with the rubble of a forgotten apocalypse. I stumbled through the husks of buildings, their hollow window sockets like the eyes of skulls, and navigated streets where tenacious green things grew through cracks in the pavement. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the crunch of my own footsteps. It was not the managed, empty silence of the archive, but a living quiet, pregnant with the weight of all that had been lost. For 2 days, I walked, fueled by dwindling nutrition packs scavenged from a maintenance locker and the fading, ghostly fire of Anya Sharma's rage. The further I went from the city, the more the hollow ache in my chest seemed to fill with the world around me. I felt the bite of the cold night air, the searing heat of the midday sun, the sharp pain of a twisted ankle. These sensations, raw and unfiltered, were a revelation. Pain, I realized, was a form of clarity. It was the body's way of reminding you that you were alive and that the world was real. On the 3rd day, as I descended into the labyrinthine canyons marked on my map, they found me. It wasn't a rescue, it was an interception. One moment I was alone, leaning against a sun-scorched rock face. The next, she was there. She had moved with a silence that seemed to bend the air around her, appearing as if from the stone itself. She was tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of raven feathers pulled back in a tight, practical braid. Her eyes, a startlingly sharp hazel, scanned me with an unnerving intensity, missing nothing. She held a long-barreled rifle, not a sleek architect weapon, but a battered, functional piece of pre-tranquility hardware that looked as worn and dangerous as she did. Her face was a landscape of emotions I had only ever seen in archives: skepticism, weariness, and a deep, guarded hostility. "You're a long way from the glass gardens, pretty man," she said, her voice a low, rough-edged thing, utterly devoid of the melodic cadence of the city. Lost, I tried to stand, to explain, but my legs were weak from exhaustion and my tongue felt thick and useless. "I'm looking for Sanctuary 7, I managed to croak, a flicker of something surprise, maybe, or just deeper suspicion passed through her eyes. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "People don't look for Sanctuary. They run to it. And you don't look like you know how to run." She gestured with the rifle. "Chip." On the ground, slowly. I did as she commanded, pulling the data chip from my pocket and placing it on the red dust between us. She never took her eyes off me as she stooped to pick it up, her movements fluid and economical. She slid it into a device on her wrist, and her expression hardened as she scanned the contents. "An archivist," she grunted, a note of contempt in her voice. "A zookeeper for dead feelings. Why are you here? Archivist, did your tour bus break down?" "They tried to attune me," I said, the words spilling out in a rush. "A seraphim. He wanted to fix a dissonance. I saw something. A file. It woke me up." She looked at me for a long, silent moment, her gaze so penetrating I felt as though she were peeling back my skin to see the truth of the wiring beneath. "Everyone who comes here has a story like that," she said, her voice flat. "Most of them are lies." She slung the rifle over her shoulder. "Get up. You can tell your story to Silas. And for your sake, I hope he finds it more interesting than I do." Her name was Alara, and she led me not to a hidden city, but to a network of caves and cliff dwellings carved into the canyon walls, connected by rope bridges and winding stone staircases. This was Sanctuary 7. There were no glowing panels or holographic emitters here. Light came from open fires and salvaged solar lamps. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and unwashed bodies. People moved with purpose, their faces etched with lines of hardship and care, but their eyes were alive. I saw a man and a woman arguing, their voices rising in anger before they broke apart. Fuming. I saw children laughing, a genuine, unrestrained sound that would have triggered a wellness alert back in the city. I saw an old woman weeping quietly as she mended a worn blanket. It was a symphony of glorious, chaotic, painful humanity. Silas was in what they called the Heart Cave, the largest of the chambers, its walls covered in charcoal drawings that told the history of their people. He was an old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as Ilara's. He sat before a low fire, and he did not rise when we entered. Ilara handed him my data chip. "Found him on the eastern ridge," she reported. "Says he's an archivist from the city. Says a seraphim tried to rebalance him. Says a file woke him up." Silas looked from her to me, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the ground opposite him. "Sit, archivist. Tell me what file is worth risking the journey through the wastes." My voice was still rough, but I found my words. I told him everything. About my life in the archive, the hollow ache of the Great Tranquility, the discovery of Remnant 734. I described the video log of Anya Sharma, the raw power of her grief turning to a diamond-hard resolve. I spoke of the feeling it had ignited in me, this alien fire that the seraphim had wanted to extinguish. When I finished, the cave was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Silas stared into the flames, his gnarled fingers steepled before him. "Rage," he said, his voice a low rumble. Grief, vengeance. You speak of these things as a man who has just discovered fire. To us, they are the air we breathe. They are the tools we use to survive. What makes you think your brief flicker of feeling makes you one of us? His question was a challenge, a wall between his world and mine. Because it was real, I said, my voice gaining a strength I didn't know I possessed. For my entire life, I have been surrounded by ghosts, by the echoes of what we were. I cataloged them, I studied them, but I never understood them. That file, it didn't just show me rage, it gave it to me. And when that seraphim tried to take it away, I realized that I would rather die with that fire inside me than live another day in the cold. I fumbled in my pack, my hands shaking slightly, and pulled out the shielded microprojector I had used in the archive's core. Let me show you. Let me show you her. Silas exchanged a long look with Alara, who stood sentinel by the entrance, her arms crossed, her face a mask of stone. After a moment, Silas gave a slow, deliberate nod. I placed the projector on the floor and activated it. A cone of pale light shot out, and the image of Anya Sharma, dirty, grieving, and incandescent with fury, flickered to life on the cave wall. Her raw, whispered words filled the chamber as she spoke of her fallen friend, of her promise of retribution. A change came over the dissonance who had gathered in the shadows of the cave. There was no shock or surprise on their faces. There was recognition. It was the look of people seeing a portrait of their own soul. When the log ended, and Anya's burning eyes faded back into the light, I looked at Silas, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the now empty cave wall, and there were tears tracking paths through the dust on his ancient cheeks. He finally turned his gaze to me, and, for the first time, I saw something other than suspicion in his eyes. I saw a flicker of kinship. We have stories of the fire souls, he said, his voice thick with emotion. From the time before the fall, those who could turn their pain into fuel, we thought they were all gone. We thought the architects had scoured their memory from the world. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. The seraphim wasn't just trying to rebalance you, archivist. They are not afraid of a single, flawed man. They are afraid of her. They are afraid of what she represents. He tapped a finger on the data chip Ilara still held. This isn't just a soldier's log. This is a key. And by bringing it here, you have not escaped a cage. You have merely unlocked a much larger one. And I fear you have just trapped us all inside it with you. The days that followed were an immersion in a world I had only ever viewed through the sterile lens of a historical document. Life in Sanctuary 7 was a constant, grueling struggle, a testament to the resilience of a people who had refused to have their souls pacified. They were farmers, hunters, engineers, and scavengers, wringing a hard existence from the bones of the old world. Their hands were calloused, their faces were weathered, and their laughter was a rare and precious currency. Silas, having accepted the authenticity of my flight, assigned Alara to be my guide and mentor, a decision she accepted with a stoic, grudging resignation. Try not to die, archivist, she told me on our first morning, her tone suggesting it was more of a command than a piece of advice. I'm a scout, not a wet nurse. Under her tutelage, I was stripped of my scholarly softness and remade. She taught me how to track desert game, how to find water in the parched earth, how to read the subtle language of the wind and the sky. She showed me how to clean and maintain a rifle, its solid, mechanical weight a comforting reality in my hands. The work was brutal. My muscles screamed in protest. My skin blistered under the relentless sun. And every night I collapsed onto my sleeping mat, a collection of aches and pains. But with the physical hardship came a new and profound sense of self. In the city, my existence had been defined by my function, by the quiet, orderly tasks I performed. Here, my existence was a verb. I was not an archivist. I was a survivor, and every sunrise was a victory I had earned. My nights, however, belonged to Silas and the Heart Cave. The elders of the community would gather by the fire, and I would listen to their stories. The oral history of the dissonant. They spoke of the early days of the architect's arrival, of the great tranquility being offered not as a gift, but as a cure for the sickness of human emotion. They told of families torn apart, of those who willingly accepted the attunements, and those who resisted, who were labeled as diseased and cast out. They called themselves the unforgiven, for they had refused to forgive the architects for the theft of their own nature. They did not conquer us with armies. Silas explained one evening, his voice a low, somber cadence against the crackle of the flames. They conquered us with a promise of heaven. They convinced us that our passions, our ambitions, our very capacity for grief and rage were the source of all our suffering. And in a world weary of war and pain, it was a seductive lie. It was during these sessions that I began to understand the true significance of Remnant 734. I played Anya Sharma's log for the elders, and they watched it with a reverent silence. For them, it was more than just a historical artifact. It was a sacred text. She is a vessel of the primal fire, an old woman named Lyra whispered, her eyes wide. The pure, undiluted essence of human will. The architects sought to extinguish that fire, to replace it with their pale, cold light. But they failed. A spark remained. My role in the community began to shift. I was no longer just the strange refugee from the city. I became the keeper of the spark, the one who had brought them this tangible link to the past they so fiercely cherished. I worked with their technicians, a resourceful group who could coax life from technology centuries old. And together we managed to restore more fragments from the shard. We uncovered tactical data, unit rosters, and fragmented communications from Anya's final days. We learned she was part of a resistance movement, a last, desperate alliance of soldiers and civilians fighting against the encroaching corporate powers that had dominated the pre-architect world. But it was a second video log, even more corrupted than the first. That changed everything. It took us weeks to stabilize the image, but when we did, a new, terrifying chapter of the past was revealed. The log showed Anya not in a combat zone, but in what looked like a makeshift laboratory. She was pale, her face etched with a grim determination, and she was speaking to the camera in a hushed, urgent tone. "We were wrong," she said, her voice strained. "We thought we were fighting men. We were fighting a philosophy. They're not just trying to win the war. They're trying to rewrite the rules of existence." Behind her, on a flickering monitor, were complex schematics and what looked like celestial charts. They found something out there. Ben. Something in the void. A signal. A presence. They called it the Architect. They believed it was a god, a source of ultimate order. They built a gate, a conduit, to bring it here. They think it will bring them peace. They think it will end the chaos. Her image dissolved into static, but her final, chilling words hung in the air of the heart cave, an indictment across the centuries. It won't bring peace. It will bring silence. A cold dread settled over the elders. Silas's face was ashen in the firelight. The architects. He breathed, the name now tasting like a curse. They were not saviors who stumbled upon a broken world. They were invited. They were summoned by the very corporations we thought they had come to save us from. The great tranquility was not a gift. It was a transaction. A desperate, power-hungry faction of humanity, on the verge of losing their final war, had made a deal with a devil they didn't understand. They had opened a door to a power that promised to end their conflict, and in return, it had consumed their entire world, remaking it in its own image of sterile, passionless order. Our entire history, the very foundation of our placid society, was a lie. We were not a rescued species. We were an occupied one. And Anya Sharma had been part of the last group of humans who had known the truth and had died trying to stop it. This revelation sent a shockwave through Sanctuary 7. The quiet, grim acceptance of their exile was shattered, replaced by a simmering, directionless anger. The architects were not benevolent caretakers. They were invaders. The seraphim were not healers. They were wardens. The unforgiven were not a sad, broken people. They were prisoners of war. "What do we do?" Silas Ilara demanded, her voice tight with a fury I had never seen in her before. She had been born in Sanctuary, had known nothing but the struggle for survival. Now, that struggle had been given a name and a face. Do we just sit here in our caves while the ghosts of our ancestors scream at us? Silas looked old and tired, the weight of this new history settling on his stooped shoulders. We are a few hundred souls in a desert. Child. Our weapons are relics. The architects control the planet. They have the warden, the seraphim, and an entire world of placid, willing servants. What can we do? We can show them the truth I said. Stepping forward, the fire from Anya's log burning in my own chest. They live in a gilded cage, but they don't know it's a cage. The people in the city are not our enemies. They are victims. If we can show them Remnant 734, if we can show them what was stolen from them, they won't be able to stay asleep. A plan began to form. A desperate, audacious gamble. The cities were controlled by the Warden, a centralized AI that managed every aspect of urban life. Its network was absolute, its firewalls impenetrable. But even a perfect system has a single point of failure. The Warden's core programming was housed in a physical location, the Nexus, a tower that stood in the heart of my old city, a gleaming spire that pierced the clouds. If we could get inside, if we could bypass its local security and broadcast Anya's logs directly into the citywide network, we could shatter the Great Tranquility with a single, undeniable truth. It was a suicide mission. An attack on the heart of the enemy with a handful of desert rebels against a global intelligence. But as I looked around the heart cave, at the faces of the unforgiven, I saw not fear, but a dawning, terrible hope. They had been defined by their dissent, by what they were against. Anya's story had given them something to fight for. The mission was codenamed Operation Echo, and Silas, with a heavy heart, gave it his blessing. He chose a small team, the best of Sanctuary scouts and technicians. Ilara was to lead. Her knowledge of the wastes was unparalleled, and her combat skills were legendary among the dissonant. And, to my own astonishment, Silas insisted that I go with them. "You are the keeper of the spark, Kalen," he said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You were the first to hear the echo. It is only fitting that you are there to cast it into the world." I was no soldier. I was a scholar who had only recently learned which end of a rifle to point at the enemy. But as I looked at Alara, who gave me a sharp, appraising nod, I knew I couldn't refuse. My journey had started in the silence of an archive, a passive observer of a dead past. Now, it was leading me to the heart of a sleeping present, with a chance to give it a future. We spent the next month preparing. We studied the schematics I had stolen from the archive, plotting a route through the subgrid to the Nexus's foundations. Our technicians worked feverishly, modifying the micro-projector into a device capable of hijacking the Nexus's broadcast signal, a skeleton key that could unlock the mind of a world. We trained, we planned, and we mourned the lives we knew we were likely to lose. On the night of our departure, the entire community gathered to see us off. They didn't wish us luck or offer words of encouragement. Instead, they performed the ritual of remembrance. One by one, they came forward and touched our foreheads, their faces solemn, their eyes burning with an ancient fire. They weren't praying for our success. They were promising to never forget our sacrifice. As I stood there, feeling the press of calloused hands and the weight of a people's hope, I finally understood the last part of Anya Sharma's promise. She had not been driven by hate. She had been driven by love. A love so fierce and so profound for what had been lost that she was willing to burn the world to avenge it. It was the purest, most terrifying, and most human of all emotions. And now, it was ours. Our journey back across the wastes was a stark reversal of my solitary flight. Where I had stumbled in fear and ignorance, we now moved with a quiet, deadly purpose. Alara led our small team of 6 with the instinct of a desert predator, guiding us through the skeletal remains of the old world under the cover of darkness, resting in the scorched shadows of ruined monoliths during the oppressive heat of the day. The wastes were no longer just a desolate landscape to me. They were a living entity, and Ilara was its interpreter. She read the stories in the wind-scoured rocks and the patterns of the scavenging birds, her senses tuned to a frequency I was only just beginning to perceive. She was a child of this broken world, and in her element. She moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. My role in the team was not as a warrior, but as a navigator of the world we sought to invade. At night, huddled around a low-heat chemical fire that cast no smoke, I would project the schematics of the city's subgrid. My archivist's memory of its forgotten pathways and hidden arteries now a critical tactical asset. I pointed out decommissioned service tunnels, abandoned pneumatic hubs, and forgotten cisterns that would allow us to bypass the warden's primary sensor nets. The others, a grim-faced woman named Zara, who was an expert in demolitions, a wiry young man called Ren, who could coax any machine back to life, and 2 silent, hulking brothers named Jax and Valerius, who served as our heavy muscle, would listen with a focused intensity. They were warriors, and I was their mapmaker, guiding them through the geography of my former prison. We breached the city's perimeter through a storm drain outlet, a gaping maw of corroded iron that smelled of stagnant water and chemical residue. The transition was like stepping from one reality into another. The wild, open air of the wastes was replaced by the oppressive, metallic hum of the subgrid. The world became a labyrinth of steel and concrete, illuminated by the cold, sterile glow of service lights. The silence here was different, too, not the living quiet of the desert, but the dead silence of a perfectly functioning machine, a silence that felt like it was listening. Ilara moved with even greater caution now, her rifle held at a low ready, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Here, she was the alien, her senses overwhelmed by the artificiality of the environment. Here, I was the native. I led them through the city's mechanical guts, a ghost in my own past. We moved through humming power conduits and past colossal waste reclamation vats. The sheer scale of the infrastructure that supported the Great Tranquility, a staggering sight. We were like bacteria in the bowels of a leviathan, insignificant and unnoticed, but carrying a disease we hoped would prove fatal. The tension was a living thing, a constant, sharp pressure behind the eyes. Every maintenance drone that zipped past, every shift in the rhythmic hum of the machinery, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. But I was no longer the trembling scholar who had fled the archive. My fear had been honed by the desert, sharpened by a purpose. It was no longer a weakness. It was a tool, a whetstone that kept my senses on a razor's edge. Our first true obstacle came as we approached the central core, near the foundations of the Nexus Tower. A pressure-sealed bulkhead, not on my schematics, blocked our path. It was new, its polished chrome a stark contrast to the aging infrastructure around it. An optical sensor, a single, glowing lavender eye, pulsed silently above the door. "Seraphim Tech," Wren whispered, his face pale in the dim light. "The warden must have upgraded security in the core sectors. It'll have a direct link. If we try to force it, they'll know we're here in seconds." Zara knelt to examine the door's magnetic seals, her touch light and probing. "I can blow it," she said, her voice a low, confident rumble. "But it won't be quiet. We'll have maybe a minute before the response teams arrive." A minute. It wasn't enough time to reach our objective. We were trapped. As the others debated their options in hushed, urgent tones, my gaze was drawn back to the lavender eye of the sensor. It was the same color as Lyran's eyes, the seraphim who had tried to heal me. I remembered the sensation of his presence, the way his voice had felt like a vibration inside my own mind. He hadn't spoken with sound waves. He had spoken with a form of resonant frequency. A thought, desperate and insane, sparked in my mind. "Wren," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The skeleton key. Can you modify its broadcast frequency?" Wren looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Modify it how it's designed to interface with the Nexus broadcast system, not a security sensor. The seraphim," I explained, the idea taking shape even as I spoke it. "They don't communicate like we do. It's a frequency, a vibration. Their technology is an extension of their biology. That sensor isn't just watching, it's feeling. It's looking for the right resonance, a signal of tranquility, a signal of compliance." I looked at the others, at their skeptical, hardened faces. I know what peace feels like. I spent my whole life drowning in it. Maybe I can teach the key how to fake it. It was a long shot, a plan born of a scholar's abstract knowledge rather than a soldier's practical experience. But we had no other choice. While Jax and Valerius stood guard, their massive forms blending into the shadows, Wren and I set to work. He carefully disassembled the skeleton key, its delicate crystalline components glowing faintly in the dark. While I closed my eyes and reached back into my memory, I forced myself to recall the feeling of the great tranquility, the placid emptiness, the serene lack of desire, the gentle, hushing whisper that had smothered my soul for a lifetime. I described the sensation to Ren, not in technical terms, but in the language of emotion, of music, of poetry. It's a perfect, unwavering chord, I murmured. My eyes shut tight. No dissonance, no tension. A single, pure note held for eternity. It's the sound of nothing. Ren, a child of the chaotic, passionate desert, struggled to comprehend. But he was a genius with technology. He translated my abstract descriptions into algorithmic patterns, adjusting the key's resonance modulator, his fingers flying across his data slate. "Try this," he said finally. His voice strained. He had reassembled the device. I took it, its surface now pulsing with a soft, lavender light, and held it up to the sensor. The effect was instantaneous. The glowing eye wavered, its color shifting from a hard, alert lavender to a softer, more passive lilac. With a quiet, pneumatic hiss, the heavy bulkhead slid open. We stared in stunned silence. I had weaponized peace. The path ahead was clearer, but the incident had put us on a knife's edge. We were moving deeper into the enemy's most sensitive territory. The architecture began to change. The rough, industrial functionality of the outer subgrid giving way to the sleek, seamless white corridors that I recognized as the underpinnings of the city's administrative sector. We were directly beneath the Nexus. Our target was a primary data conduit, a massive, shielded channel that ran from the Nexus's core processors up to the broadcast antenna at its peak. According to my schematics, an auxiliary maintenance junction on this level would give us direct access. We found it, a small, unassuming panel in the wall, indistinguishable from 100 others. This was the moment of truth. Ren set to work, his tools moving with a surgeon's precision as he bypassed the panel's outer casing. Jax and Valerius took up positions at either end of the corridor, their rifles raised, while Ilara and Zara stood over us, a silent, deadly pair of sentinels. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I clutched the skeleton key, its surface still pulsing with its false song of peace. Ren gave a sharp nod. "I'm in. The conduit is exposed. But the moment we interface, the warden will know. We'll have minutes, maybe less." Ilara looked at me, her hazel eyes blazing with an intensity that mirrored Anya Sharma's. "It's your time. Archivist. Make the echo loud." I took a deep breath and connected the key. The instant the connection was made, the world changed. The calm, harmonious hum of the city's systems, a sound that had been the constant, unnoticed background of my entire life, was replaced by a rising, discordant shriek of alarm. Red emergency lights bathed the white corridor in a hellish glow. A synthesized voice, calm but laced with an unmistakable urgency, echoed through the halls. "Security breach detected in Nexus Core. Unidentified emotional resonance signature. Containment teams dispatched." We had kicked the hornet's nest. Ren's fingers flew across his slate. "It's fighting me. The warden is trying to lock me out." "Hold it!" Ren Zara barked, already placing a small dirt magnetic charge on the wall beside the conduit. "Buy us as much time as you can." I closed my eyes, focusing all my will on the data shard of Remnant 734. Now. Ren opened the channel. The projector on the skeleton key flared to life, and on the pristine white wall of the corridor, the image of Anya Sharma, fierce and grieving, appeared. Her raw, powerful words, the promise of vengeance born from love, began to pour into the data stream. A virus of pure, undiluted humanity injected directly into the heart of the machine. It's working. Ren yelled over the rising alarm. The broadcast is going out citywide. At that moment, the corridor ahead of us was flooded with figures in white. They were not security drones, but seraphim, their beautiful, placid faces now cold and impassive, their hands holding sleek, silver rods that crackled with energy. Behind them, I saw him, Lyran. His lavender eyes were fixed on me, and for the first time, his serene expression was gone, replaced by a look of cold, profound fury. You cannot bring the sickness back. Archivist. His voice vibrated in my head, a wave of pure psychic pressure. The age of pain is over. Alara didn't hesitate. For him, maybe. She snarled and raised her rifle. The corridor erupted in a storm of chaos. The raw, concussive bang of her pre-tranquility weapon, a brutal sacrilege in this sterile world. The battle for the soul of humanity had begun. The crack of Alara's rifle was the sound of a shattering world. It was a raw, ugly, concussive roar that tore through the sterile hum of the corridor, a sound of pure, violent dissent. The first seraphim, his face a mask of serene surprise, dissolved in a spray of silvery light and burnt ozone. The others didn't flinch. They raised their energy rods, and the air filled with the high-pitched whine of coherent energy. Jax and Valerius became a wall of flesh and fury. Their heavy-duty pulse rifles, salvaged from pre-tranquility armories, spitting blue fire. They were not fighting with the detached grace of the seraphim. They were fighting with the desperate, earth-shaking rage of a cornered animal. Their every shot a curse. A bolt of silver energy struck Jax in the chest, and he staggered, a look of shocked betrayal on his face. But he didn't fall. He roared, a sound of pure defiance, and emptied his weapon into the advancing line of white robes before Valerius pulled him back into the relative cover of the conduit junction. The seraphim did not just fight with light, they fought with silence. As they advanced, a wave of psychic pressure washed over us, a suffocating blanket of pure apathy. My thoughts grew sluggish. My anger felt distant and foolish. The fierce purpose that had driven me here dissolving into a gray, pointless fatigue. Beside me, Ren cried out and clutched his head, his fingers trembling. "I can't focus," he gasped, his face beaded with sweat. They're making me forget why I'm angry. "Remember Sanctuary," Alara yelled, her voice a sharp, cutting blade through the psychic fog. "Remember the fire." She fired again, her movements economical and deadly, her mind a fortress of disciplined fury that the Seraphim's influence could not breach. While the battle raged, a war of fire and will in the narrow corridor, our silent weapon continued its work. On the wall, Anya Sharma's ghost kept whispering her promise of vengeance, her words flowing into the city's data stream. I could feel the effect, a tremor in the very foundations of the building. The alarms began to shift their tone from a clean, synthesized alert to a chaotic, discordant scream. The warden was breaking, and as it broke, so did the world above. In the sun-drenched plazas, people stopped. The faint, pleasant smiles on their faces faltered. A man looking at a holographic flower display suddenly clutched his chest. a look of profound, unidentifiable sorrow on his face. A woman dropped her nutrient paste, her eyes wide with a terror she had no name for. The Great Tranquility was a dam, holding back 1 billion souls' worth of repressed ancestral memory, and we had just hammered the first crack into its surface. Anya's rage was the key, unlocking the gates of their own forgotten pain. They weren't just hearing her story, they were beginning to remember their own. Back in the corridor, Lyran glided through the chaos of the battle, untouched and serene. His focus was entirely on me. The other seraphim were holding back the dissonance, but he was the true weapon, and his target was the source of the infection. He raised a hand, and the world dissolved. I was no longer in a corridor. I was floating in a sea of stars, watching galaxies bloom and die like flowers in a time-lapse film. Lyran's voice was the universe itself, calm and vast and eternal. "You see this," he communicated, his thoughts pouring directly into mine. "It is a symphony of creation. But in every symphony, there are discordant notes, species that rise, consumed by their own passions. Their rage burns stars. Their grief collapses suns. They are the sickness. They are the pain." He showed me visions of worlds on fire, of civilizations tearing themselves apart in paroxysms of emotion I could barely comprehend. It was the history of the universe as a catalog of self-inflicted wounds. "We are not conquerors," he explained, the thought resonating with a profound, unshakable sincerity. "We are the cure. We are a conscious philosophy of peace. We travel the void, finding the discordant notes, and we soothe them. We offer tranquility. We offer an end to suffering. We offered it to your creators, and they accepted. We are not your jailers. Kalen, we are your salvation." His logic was a crushing weight, the compassionate, irrefutable argument of a god. For a moment, my own purpose felt small and selfish. What was one species' right to feel pain compared to the peace of a galaxy? But then, through the cosmic grandeur of his vision, a single image fought its way to the surface. Anya Sharma's face, streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes burning with a love so fierce it had become a weapon. She had not been a discordant note. She had been a symphony of her own. "You call it a sickness," I gasped, the words tearing from my throat as I fought against his mental grip. My own voice a pathetic human squeak in the face of his cosmic choir. "But our pain is our history. Our rage is the engine of our growth. That grief you want to cure, it's the measure of our love. You haven't saved us. You've erased us." I clutched the skeleton key, the last artifact of my old life, and poured every ounce of my own newfound, fragile, and gloriously painful humanity into it. I thought of Ilara's grim determination, of Silas's weary sorrow, of the laughing children in Sanctuary 7 who knew the joy of a full belly because they also knew the ache of hunger. I thought of Anya. The lavender light of the key flickered, then blazed with a brilliant, defiant gold. The corridor slammed back into reality around me. Lyran staggered back, an expression of pure shock on his perfect face, a trickle of silver fluid leaking from his nose. For the first time, he was feeling the echo of my messy, chaotic human emotions, and it was poison to him. At that moment, a section of the wall beside us exploded inward. Zara, her face grim, held up a smoking detonator. The broadcast is locked in a recursive loop. The warden's core logic is fried. "It's done," she yelled. "But we're out of time," Through the hole she had blasted, I could see the churning, mechanical chaos of a different part of the subgrid. It was our only escape. "Go," Elara screamed, shoving Ren and me toward the opening. She and the wounded Jax laid down a field of suppressing fire. Valerius, his huge body shielding the retreat, was struck by 3 energy bolts at once and fell without a sound. I looked back one last time. Lyran had recovered, his face now a mask of cold, alien wrath. He and the remaining Seraphim were advancing, their movements no longer graceful, but filled with a lethal urgency. Zara met their charge, a defiant grin on her face as she triggered the last of her explosives, bringing the ceiling down in a tidal wave of steel and concrete, sealing the corridor, sealing her fate, but buying our escape. Elara dragged me through the darkness of the subgrid, the sounds of our footsteps echoing the frantic, terrified, and liberated beating of my heart. We ran until our lungs burned, until the sounds of the collapsing nexus were a distant rumble behind us. When we finally emerged, pushing open a maintenance hatch into the world above, it was to a city reborn. The great tranquility was dead. The silence had been shattered, replaced by a bewildering cacophony. People were stumbling through the plazas, their faces streaked with tears they didn't understand. Some were shouting, their voices hoarse with a rage they had never known. Strangers were clutching each other, sharing a grief for losses they had never personally experienced, but were now feeling as a collective. Inherited trauma. The city's harmonious emitters were silent. The warden's gentle voice was gone. For the first time in centuries, the only sounds were the sounds of humanity. It was terrifying. It was chaos. It was beautiful. Ilar and I stood in the shadow of a skyscraper, watching the sunrise. It was no longer filtered through an atmospheric lens to be a perfect, placid gold. It was a raw, brilliant, painful crimson, streaked with the grays and purples of an unfiltered dawn. My journey was over. I had left this city a keeper of ghosts and returned as the midwife to its rebirth. We hadn't won a war. We had simply given the world back its own heart in all its broken, messy, and magnificent glory. The future was a terrifying unknown, a path that led back into the tumult. There would be pain. There would be conflict. There would be sorrow. But it would be ours. We stood on the edge of a new age. 2 survivors, a desert scout and an archivist, and watched as humanity, for the first time in a very long time, finally woke up